I'm honored to introduce once again Blaise Fontaine, who will guide this session on Indigenous leadership and transmission development. So Blaise is a member of Pequot Kanagan First Nation and Swiss Canadian. She's the director of engagement and co-founder of Proactive Planning and started her career in Indigenous community engagement 17 years ago. So Blaise will moderate this fire shot discussion. So Blaise, thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So I'm a moderator, but I'm also talking. So we're doing, it's going to be a little bit unconventional. This is a topic that all three of us are really passionate about, and that each of us bring unique experience to. So you're going to hear from me, and you're going to hear from my colleagues here, and it's going to be a good conversation, I think. So it's meant to be informal. So yeah, if you do have questions as we go along, feel free to jump in. We want this information to be accessible, easy to understand. It's something that we haven't talked about yet in this forum, and so I think this will be a good opportunity to explore these topics. So yeah. Slide. I refuse to run my own slides. So yeah, my name is Blaise Fontaine. Anaminike means little thundercloud. So I co-founded a company called Proactive Planning. I function as the director of engagement on the day-to-day. So what we do at Proactive Planning is we work with linear infrastructure developers and operators, from project concept to construction and operation. And so we provide services ranging from planning, GIS, but most importantly, what I do is I do Indigenous and municipal engagement, starting at the early onset and again, all the way through formal consultation and project operations. So yeah, that's what I do. And I wanted to talk to you today about our regalia. Representation is very important for Indigenous people in spaces like these. And so I'm wearing a ribbon skirt today, and I wear this skirt because I'm proud of who I am, and to represent in a space like this is really important. And my colleagues here are also wearing regalia, and if there's anything that you'd like to say about your regalia, I'd love that.
So I also opted to wear a ribbon shirt. And
is your mic check?
No, it doesn't. Switch it off.
Shake it.
Can you hear me now? Hello. No, there we go. Ooh, it is loud. So yes, we agreed that we would wear some traditional clothing today. So I also have a ribbon shirt and a medallion that signifies the clan that I belong to. So I'm a wolf clan.
Yeah, it's a great shirt. I love the wolves. I need some of that. Yeah, and the Chanoff, the whale, the wolf was a transformer, and they came from the killer whales. We have a special connection to the killer whales, and there's some resident pods here. Yeah, this is it's not my traditional regalia. On my Cree side it is, but this shirt is from Trudier, from the Soto First Nation. My father is Cree, Treaty 6 from Alexander First Nation, which is like just a 45-minute northwest drive from Edmonton. So it's a shout out to my Cree side and number of treaties.
That's why he's so tall. Indigenous people bring humor to all their work, so I hope that we can bring stories and humor to our work today. So yeah, I was supposed to talk a bit about my work, and I want my colleagues here to talk about their work too, and why we're interested in this topic, and why we're here really. So Cole, can you take it away, and then I'll hand it over to Gus.
Yeah, for sure. I think some of you may know my work with Clean Energy BC. I'm not here today in that capacity, but I'm a big advocate for First Nations partnership. First Nations led and partnerships in clean energy. We have a lot of projects here in BC and across Canada where First Nations are leading these projects with our industry partners, and so we have a very, very good groundwork for that. And we're now moving that towards transmission. And trying to learn about the transmission opportunities for First Nations in each jurisdiction, because each province is procuring power, but we also recognize the need for transmission build out, and First Nations ought to be part of that equity. And there's a lot of benefits that we'll get into further. But I'm here as an advocate, as a First Nation, as a BC First Nation, but also having strong roots in Treaty 6. So when it comes to the intertie, just as an individual who's First Nations and has some experience in the electricity industry, I think it's really fascinating, and obviously all the benefits that the speakers have gone over the past few days, I agree with. So very excited to speak about that opportunity and transmission. It's a newer one with clean energy. That's also pretty new. The electricity industry has been marked by exclusion and marginalization, and there hasn't been much benefits to First Nations. So from the First Nations perspective, we want to benefit. We want to have reparations for damage done to our territories. And so now that we're moving to this era of reconciliation, we can talk about benefits to First Nations through these new infrastructure projects, whether it's generation, transmission. So that's part of it. But I'll leave it there and pass it over to my colleagues.
Sego Zawagwegu, Gasanahoe Sky Deer Ujats, Gahnawagini de Wagano, Dano Wagatahunini Wagitaroda. So my name is Gasanahoe Sky Deer. I come from Mohawk territory, just outside of Montreal in Quebec. As I mentioned, Wolf Clan. I'm formally the Grand Chief of my community. My mandate ended this past summer, but I served on the council for 15 years. So being a part of the political sphere, most recently, I launched my own consulting business. But the reason why I'm here and Blaze invited me to come and speak to all of you today to talk about a very important project that my community was a part of, still is, in terms of a partnership with a transmission line called Hertel on the Canadian side and called CHIPE or CHPE, the Champlain Hudson Power Express line, to bring clean, renewable electricity from Quebec to Astoria, New York. So yeah, that's my involvement in transmission, and I'm really eager to share this phenomenal story with all of you.
And then on that note, we'll just go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Do you want to do the movie?
Yeah, maybe just first the first slide prior to that.
There's a typo in her name. That's my fault.
Oh yeah, there's
there's
an N missing before the H.
I know how to spell her name. I feel really bad about it.
Yeah, so this was a photo that was taken in New York. This is Mr. Dean Fulline, who at the time was associate to the mayor, Bill de Blasio, who had informed me directly that had the Mohawks not been involved in this project, that Hydro-Quebec would not have been awarded the contract. So, our involvement was very instrumental in this, and myself personally, going and speaking to environmental justice groups all through the Adirondacks and, bringing our perspective into this and the necessity for us to be a true partner. So maybe we'll cue the movie and then I'll speak a little bit more.
The movie is non-negotiable. In the meantime, Gus has prepared a dance for us.
Oh God, don't even. Should have did a sound check at the intermission.
Do you want me to bring my microphone over?
Kasanahoe Sky Deer Ujats, Wagatahuni, Tano Gahnawage, Nita Wagano, Tanani Ine Hondu Ia Dene Ratizahayas, Kasanahoe Sky Deer, Wolf Clan. I'm from Gahnawage, Mohawk territory, and I am the Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council of Gahnawage.
The Mohawk Skywalkers were First Nations or Indigenous people from Mohawk communities who came to New York City to help build the New York City skyline and bridges and different infrastructure. Mohawk Skywalkers helped build the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Plaza, and most recently, the Freedom Tower. So Mohawk skywalking and the tradition of ironwork is now something that we see that is passed on through the generations. Moving forward now with this project, with the Hertel interconnection and the fact that we will be a partner in being able to provide hydroelectricity to the city of New York is definitely an exciting project and a natural progression for the Kanien'kehá:ka or the Mohawk people in helping now to light up the New York City skyline that we were a part of building. Protecting the environment and being, I guess, environmental stewards is definitely important to who we are. We have what's called the Ahondagariwadekwa, and the words that come before all else. And what it tells us is that all things in creation are interconnected and that we have a responsibility to give thanks for them and to look out for them. So we're proud to be a partner with Hydro-Quebec in this project to bring clean, renewable energy to the city of New York. The fact that it meets that criteria of what we look for in a project, that environmental stewardship and protecting the environment is definitely helping to, lower the emissions here in New York City. It's going to be a economic revenue generator for the community of Kahnawake. And now what's exciting is this generation of Kanien'kehá:ka, our Mohawk people, will help to light up the New York City skyline and energize it with clean, renewable hydroelectricity.
So that video is a few years old. The CEO who was in that video, Sophie Brochu, is no longer the CEO of Hydro-Quebec. But what's interesting about the formation of that relationship, it was the first time there was a woman CEO and the first time there was a woman Grand Chief in the role. And when we first had our meetings to discuss this partnership, we said, you know what, we got to do things differently. We got to think outside of the box. The old way of doing things was not working. There's been a lot of historical wrongs. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of relationship building that has to happen. So we decided that we were going to start equal to equal and put people at the forefront of this relationship. And that was basically how things really started in terms of this initiative moving forward. Another thing I have to highlight is, they had been conceptualizing this project for many years, and the Grand Chief prior to myself was adamant that, in order for us to be supporters of it, we needed to be a part of it. We wanted partnership. We didn't want an impact benefit agreement or something, that was going to be a one-off. We wanted this to be long-lasting. And part of the way we were able to, I'll say for us, reconcile historical wrongs, because there had been a number of land expropriations and transmission lines that were cutting through our territory, was that we had to go backward and decommission the ones and take them down, the ones that weren't operational, and then get adequate compensation for the ones that were still in operation. So that also set the stage for us to move forward. There's so much more to talk about this. I'm going to leave it there at this point. But like you said, I don't know if people have questions, but I think as we progress through the dialogue today, a lot more will be shared.
I had to tell her to hold back. I had to tell both of them that we have to hold back, or else we'll just say everything all on one side. But yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this is a really important concept to us, and something that we wanted to talk about right away. So people first, how do we promote relationship and trust building between nations, transmission developers, and commercial partners? So Gus said it best, that one of our first teachings is the interconnection of all things. And that includes people to people, people to the earth, people to the animals. And what I want to say about that is that when I work with a client, when I'm working with a developer, an infrastructure developer, I go to these communities as if they were my own. I might not even know who I'm meeting with that day, but I treat them as if they're my own people. And it's when you start from that way, when you start in a good way, You're coming to them with respect and humility, and that's how you can start to get the conversations going. That's how you can start to build trust. And I really think that that Cole and Goss can expand on this and how they bring this into their work.
Yeah, I think you make a great point around, you know, one's relationship to the First Nations you're working on or hoping to work with. You know, even as an Indigenous person, I think about that too. And I remember like my cousin Johnny Mack, he's a professor at UBC, our School of Law, and he used to say, I'm trespassing here when he's at UVic to the song he's in the Esquimalt because I haven't followed my. He's also Nuu-chah-nulth. We haven't followed our laws of coming ashore, asking permission to come here to do our business, and then being welcomed through their ceremonies and following their protocols. And I used to say that a lot. And then a colleague of mine did welcome us into the big house, and so at least at that point in my life, you know, we got welcomed here to do a certain, you know, certain period and some work. But it's always top of mind too, as I am an advocate for First Nations, learning about what are your priorities and speaking at a high level, like this is how we can create an opportunity for you. So if they want wheeling, well, that's been a long priority for nations in BC, where they want to have wheeling opportunities, they want to have enhanced selling opportunities, because they're building up their capacity. They know that this is going to lead to more economic development for them and their region. So how do we do that? What's the regulatory changes? What are the policy changes that we need to do to do that, to facilitate that? Yeah, very important topic, and yeah, Blaise has made some excellent points on your relationship to the First Nation and how it has to be maintained. And I know the Mohawk have some really good teachings around how to maintain political relationships.
I remember one of the media in New York, in Montreal, asking Sophie, why do you feel it's important to include the Mohawks in this project? And she said, because we're going through their house. And that was the first time that we ever heard somebody, and as a CEO of a Crown corporation, recognize our unceded historical territory, because really it's the Hertel line is not going through Kahnawake, like our actual village or community. It's going on the outskirts, and it's running alongside of infrastructure that's already there, being Highway 15 and then through the 87 up into New York State. But you know, that first actual recognition was really a step in the right direction. And then from there, you know, building a relationship with the community. We were also in the midst of building a major project. It's a cultural center, a museum, amphitheater, and a tourism building. It's a $56 million project. So Hydro-Quebec committed $10 million to that project. You know, that for us also showed the commitment. And then throughout the time that, you know, I was constantly going to New York to meet with individuals to help move this project along, the players remained consistent, and we built actual friendships and relationships. So that to me helped, you know, move this along, and the whole experience of it all was really great.
Think I have anything to add?
Add to that?
Yeah,
I just want to like highlight that it takes leadership from the top to make First Nations a priority. Like the previous CEO of Hydro-Quebec made a priority that we're going to include the Mohawk of Kahnawake in this project. And you know, the next CEO has, I think, at least from the outside, has continued that leadership where we're going to have governance rights and financial benefits to the First Nations. And so I think it's definitely showing other Crown utilities in across Canada how to do this. That it's got to come from the top, and it's got to come from, it's got to be a commitment. And we've heard from a developer yesterday that they make a concerted effort. They go beyond their legal obligations to include First Nations into their development of their project. And that's key moving forward, is making sure that First Nations feel like they're a true partner, that you're working with them from an early stage. And so it's really encouraging to hear. I was telling them I just wanted to hear Goss talk about the story, the entire time, because there's so many great things to that story. But
No, it sets a true precedent for other developers as well. And we are going to talk about this shortly, but it really is the future of transmission development. And yeah, we'll talk about it later. Got to hold back. I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, not business as usual. So yeah, this is fun. So the industry playbook of Indigenous inclusion as an afterthought is no longer enough to get projects through. So what does true inclusion look like? So I have worked with all sorts of energy companies, all sorts of linear infrastructure operators in most of Western Canada. And so when they come to me, I tell them that if we're going to work together, we're going to do things right. We're going to start things off the right way. And that's a really good way to lose clients. So, but in reality, I've been very fortunate that that most of my clients agree with my ethos and they're willing to see things through with me. And it's interesting in the type of work that I'm in. When I'm hired, clients kind of have this expectation that I'll be advocating for them, and what ends up happening is I advocate for the communities that I'm working for, and I tell my clients how to best work with these communities, and that's how you work best together. It's not a versus situation. It's how are we going to do this together? So when my clients come to me and they want to start to do things right, we start to look at their own internal policies and processes, programming, stuff like that. Because if you're not changing things from the inside, then once I'm gone, what's going to happen? Who's going to carry on this work after I leave? So I want to make sure that the legacy of this good work will continue beyond my time with them. So we look at Indigenous inclusion frameworks. We look at stuff like reconciliation action plans, things of that nature. But then we start to look at some of their Indigenous participation models. So what do those models look like? So we're going to be talking about those models, I believe, in the next slide. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Right, so we have a bunch of models here. So the first two things are impact benefit agreements and mutual benefit agreements, and they're kind of the same thing a lot of the time. And these are agreements that are largely imposed on Indigenous communities. And this is generally done in exchange for communities' cooperation during a regulatory process, which is, they are important documents, but, they're not the end all be all. It shouldn't be what project proponents are solely striving for. And yeah, these agreements ensure that that communities are compensated adequately for the disturbance on their lands, but what they're missing is those meaningful participation opportunities, right? And so when you stop seeing projects as simply just impacts and benefits, and start to see them as these opportunities for working together and creating, a legacy of good work, then we're able to move forward. So some of the other modeling that I have, I don't know. So some of the other modeling, and this list is by no means exclusive. So there's definitely other things out there, but we're talking about early project planning. So when an operator, a developer wants to engage with communities at the early onset of a project, so in the conceptual stages of a project, to get take the temperature, find out what the priorities are of the nations, what do they need so that they can participate meaningfully in the project. So that's one form. We also have Indigenous inclusion and environmental assessment processes. I feel like that's self-explanatory. Mapping and GIS. Indigenous communities contribute hugely to data generation to GIS and mapping systems. And that's one, I feel like it's something that is so often overlooked, is the way that Indigenous communities contribute to this data. And Indigenous people know their lands, and it's something that, yeah, they want to be a part of that. Also, community investment. I feel like I hope this is something that we all know about. And these are generally just gifts or a client's participation in events, and it's good. But so community investment can be a part of impact benefit agreements or mutual benefit agreements, but it can also be something and this is meaningful, it can be something that you can put in place prior to getting to that agreement place. It's something that you can work on with the communities in these early planning stages, where you ask them, what are their priorities? What does your community need? What sort of participation from us would be meaningful to you? And if you, when you start there, instead of waiting to get to the lawyers at the impact benefit agreement stage, it's much better for relationships, and you're demonstrating trust and you're demonstrating reciprocity. So, and then, the gold standard of Indigenous inclusion is equity and ownership. So we're going to talk a lot more about that, but Indigenous equity and ownership, this is the future of new infrastructure projects, transmission projects in this country, because, like I said, the precedent has been set, and Ganawage is one example, but there are many other examples of equity situations or equity opportunities that have been offered and retained by Indigenous communities, and this is the way forward. So if a developer isn't going to offer equity, somebody else will. So, and then lastly, this is employment training and procurement. So this is something that kind of comes a little bit later on, and it's really to continue to involve the community in the construction and the operation of a project, and it's a whole thing on itself. So we'll kind of leave it there. But is there anything else that you think I missed, or is there anything else that you would like to talk about in this regard?
Yeah, I'll just maybe highlight a couple of things on this slide that kind of tie into the project that we were able to move forward, and the fact that it's a limited partnership where we had to create a new LP to be co-owners. We could invest equity up to 49%. Obviously, it will depend on the risk that the community and the council wants to take in conversation with the community. The fact that they included our environmental office to do some assessment on the impacts that it would have environmentally, so that we could live with, obviously, if you see the size of the transmission, it's really about this big. It's only going to be like a meter and a half down the trench by a meter wide, and again, running alongside of infrastructure that's already there. So we didn't feel that it was a major impact environmentally. The fact that as First Nations, who are, our nation is basically cut right across by the US-Canadian border, and the recognition of our ability to exercise the Jay Treaty. Mohawk people can live, work in the United States, without being treated as like immigrant alien, having to get a green card. And that's how we were able to, build New York City, as I mentioned earlier, the Skywalkers. So the ability for employment now and being able to work on the installation of the line is also important. I already talked about the community investment into a project that was near and dear to us. This is a 40-year agreement, so it'll have revenue generation back to the community for 40 years. So, when we looked at how this project was really going to, push our community forward, and again, be a trailblazer. I think, Mohawk people, we tend to look at ourselves and taking risks, thinking outside of the box, trying something new. And again, we want to help to see other First Nations in Quebec that were impacted previously by, whether it was the flooding of lands, or Quebec has a pretty ambitious energy target for 2030, 2035, that we could help our brother and sister communities now, because of our experience going through this project, that, we help them along if they don't have the kind of, legal experience, how to get the right deal for them. So we see ourselves facilitating in that regard as well.
Sweet. Cool.
Yeah, I just love that story where, the Mohawks have built Manhattan skyline, and now you're going to help keep the lights on. It's just such a cool story. And there's a lot there, and this is just all very important for project development, getting projects built. And I think, it's sometimes these discussions become abstract or academic, but when it comes down to building projects, it's very important to do this early work. And I think there might be some folks who haven't done that and are now going to First Nations later on in the project and realizing that they're in a lot of trouble. So making sure your relationships with First Nations are there early on is very important, because then it's just going to streamline the project, it's going to de-risk it, and we're going to get the projects built, and everybody wins.
This feeds perfectly into our next slide. So this is recognizing sovereignty. So Indigenous sovereignty can be a powerful ally for commercial partners and political strongholds. So how is Indigenous leadership and transmission development changing legislation and the way that business is being conducted? So Indigenous nations, they're political entities. So we possess political power, and that's something that I feel is often overlooked, or it's that political power is seen more as a barrier to development rather than the asset that it can possibly be. So when we are talking about building these relationships, building this trust, building these partnerships can be transformed into a type of political support that can help get projects across the finish line. And we're spinning our wheels about the Alberta BC intertie, and I feel like Kristen was like so close to saying it that maybe a shift in our political thinking is necessary, because we forget that our nations are political and that we are powerful and that we do have the power to persuade and apply political pressure in these tight spots where we just can't seem to get any traction. So I don't want to say too much about that, because we're going to talk more about legal things and stuff. So is there anything that you guys want to add?
I'll just highlight how I had to go to the National Assembly in Quebec to get them to modify legislation so that a First Nation can be a co-owner of a major infrastructure with the Crown Corporation, which was like the first of its kind. And again, it was all based on the recognition of our nationhood, our historical territory, and the influence that we were able to have with New York, because Mohawks are all along the East Coast, Eastern Woodland, all the way into, Mohawk Valley by Syracuse and upstate New York area. And then obviously we are also in the, like I said, this imaginary border that was imposed on us that, has kind of been an encumbrance. We don't necessarily recognize that it can be a barrier, and we were able to influence the powers that be with NYSERDA and the approval bodies so that we could get this project over the line. So yes, not being looked at as a barrier, but being looked at as a viable partner was a major shift.
Awesome. So I'm gonna hand it over to Cole. He's Mr. Poli-Sci. And I think just so that we're all kind of starting on the same foot here, just kind of recognizing sovereignty and recognizing rights. What does that look like? What does it mean in the Canadian Constitution? And then we're gonna just really briefly talk about UNDRIP, because then we're gonna move into the consent model that is in the regulatory framework that we have to work with. So go ahead, Cole.
Yeah, well, I'm probably the wrong person to answer this because I'm not a lawyer, but, obviously along the potential intertie or, lines connecting an intertie, it crosses Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and you get into possibly, non-treaty areas and Aboriginal rights. So it's very different. Treaty 8, there's the Blueberry case where, accumulative effects is, there's some sensitivities there that the nations hold a lot of weight. And so the First Nations along these lines, especially in BC, I think we have heightened expectations now with the UNDRIP legislation, the DRIPA, that we want to move from consultation, accommodation to shared decision-making, to consent-based models where, First Nations are part of the decision-making authorities and decision-making. And so we wanted to include this slides to provide that context here that we expect to be a partner, and because these critical infrastructures are crossing Indigenous lands, and you need the First Nations buy-in into these projects. And I think we've provided so far a pretty good start on how we can do that in a good way.
Just really quickly onto the UNDRIP slide. Thank you. Cole, can you just, I know that you kind of touched on it, can you just kind of explain how these things play into each other and how this kind of leads to, well, it's moving away from duty to consult and just the sole concept of duty to consult, but free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah, and as you said, like equity ownership is becoming one way that this translates into consent, and IBAs. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I think IBAs recognize the rights holder, that we are providing benefits. We recognize that this project was within your territory, and then there's a corporate relationship with the First Nation, with usually a development arm, that will have the equity ownership, and then that's a joint venture. That's the equity ownership holder on behalf of the community. And so that's kind of the movement that we're seeing across Canada as we see the evolution of equity ownership and equity partnerships. That's in line with the UNDRIP, and it's in line with consent and getting First Nation support for these projects in their territories.
Great. Next, we're going to be talking about support and consent, and this is, I'm going to be asking Gus to chime in quite a bit here, but so I'll just read the question because I'm sure you can read. But how should project support be built prior to formal consultation? So I'm just going to actually just hand it over to Gus. Like, what are some of the ways that that project support was built prior to entering, more formal processes for the Hertel line?
Well, this one was very unique because I know that they had already been exploring this idea for long before we had heard about it and became included. So we were an afterthought, as a matter of fact.
Don't do that.
But the fact is that it wasn't too late. There was still the ability for us to garner support in the community. Obviously, the whole table, right? I have to also explain the difference between maybe elected system and traditional systems of governance, which a lot of times are at odds with each other in First Nations communities. So I was the Grand Chief of the elected system called the Mohawk Council of Ganawage. And, it's a representative democracy. So we're voted in and we make decisions. Of course, we always want to try to engage with community as best as possible, but a lot of times community members aren't coming out as much as we would like. We did a lot of media blitzing because we have our own local radio station. We have 2 newspapers in the community. So we were constantly putting out information, at community meetings, garnering what kind of feedback, like, do people really see how important of a milestone having a project like this, what it means to the community and so forth. So where we started to hear maybe some grumblings, obviously, was from other First Nations in Quebec, like, why you? Here we are the ones who went through all these historical wrongs and, flooding and et cetera. But we said, okay, we understand that. Your issue is with hydro, but we also know that they're trying to do differently now, and we want to help move the needle forward. We can't change what has happened historically, but we could definitely control what happens moving into the future. So let us, help create these kind of relationships. And then, of course, we know that the fossil fuel industry was also really trying to create barriers for this project to move forward. When we went into communities in like Queens, Astoria, it's always like the marginalized communities where these major fossil fuel plants and nuclear plants and stuff are in their backyard. We visited people in Asthma Alley, and we said, you know what, here's Mohawk people now who are trying to help advance and move this project in a way that, yes, we understand that there's all these issues permeating through our experience historically, through what you have been through as marginalized communities, but let's, take approach where this includes all of us in a good way. And yeah, so it definitely took a lot of time, energy, and effort, I'll say, to get the support and the consent, even to get the EJ groups, environmental justice groups behind it, to hear from our perspective and to say that, we're going to help. We're going to help facilitate relations with our brother and sister communities in Quebec. And that's part of our commitment moving forward to do that. But yeah, so we did eventually get the necessary support and consent to move the project forward. Obviously, you're never going to have 100% support in anything, but I think the majority of the community was able to see merit in us proceeding with this project in the way that we are. It's slated to be commissioned in 2026. I saw that they're laying down the lines underwater now in Lake Champlain, so things are moving along. And yeah, it's definitely a success. And like I said, there'll definitely be some learning along the way of things that maybe could have been done differently. But nonetheless, it's moving and it's great. And we're very happy about it. And that's why I'm here to share the experience and hope that, it can maybe lend an ability for others to try an approach like this and include First Nations at maybe not necessarily at the forefront. Yes, we're saying that that's probably the best approach, but even if you already have something that's maybe halfway through, it's never too late to approach the nations whose territory it's going to run through and provide them the ability to become included. I think that's what we want. We've been sidelined for far too long with economic development strategies, energy strategies, and we want to prove that we can be really valuable players in the game.
This actually works really nicely. So yeah, the next slide. We didn't rehearse this, but so something that Gus just said is that that there's not, even if you're not working with nations right at the very onset of a project, and you're coming in later on, you're right, it's not too late. And some of those other mechanisms that we see to build that support so that you can get to that consent. Yeah, the early communication and engagement, but also something that's really important that can be overlooked is capacity funding. If you're asking nations for their time, if you're asking chief of council for their time, a lot of these positions are unpaid or underpaid, dramatically underpaid. So what are you bringing to the table so that you're treating them like an equal? So capacity funding is really important, helping to pay for some of those assessments and whatever is needed at those early stages to help de-risk the project and bring it further down the engagement and consultation process. Also, employing shared decision-making modeling, and this is when you're working on linear infrastructure projects, you're most likely traversing more than one traditional territory. You're most likely traversing many traditional territories. So it's something that I continue to put food into thought. It's food for thought. Like, what do those shared decision-making models look like when you are working with multiple nations at the same time, and there has to be relative equity across the board. Inclusion in project planning. I've talked about that, but Indigenous nations should be involved in routing. Sorry, there's Americans and Canadians here. Routing processes. It's a debate that I'll never settle it. In routing and where should a line go? Where should a project go? And what areas are important to these nations? And like I said, Indigenous people, they know their lands. And there's a lot of things that Indigenous people can tell you that Google Maps won't. So yeah, and then Of course, with linear infrastructure projects, you're looking at multiple nations, and so how do you treat these nations equally while also respecting their unique priorities? And so you can go at that by ensuring that you're bringing forward agreements that are informed by the nations that you're working with, that these nations play a pivotal role in the development of these agreements, because if you want a nation to sign something, I feel like they should, be a part of writing it. So making sure that their needs and their priorities are represented these are all good ways. I guess this isn't an exclusive list, but these are good ways to build support. Anything you guys want to add? Cool. Yeah, we're just about leave 10 minutes for questions. So what does the future of transmission development look like in Canada? If you haven't gathered already, we believe that the future of transmission is Indigenous. It's Indigenous led, it's Indigenous owned. That these meaningful participation opportunities, these meaningful partnerships are brought to the forefront, and that they become the focus of these projects, not the infrastructure itself, but the relationships. So that's kind of my 2 cents, but I'll pass it to these guys.
Yeah, as I mentioned, Quebec has a pretty ambitious energy strategy. And it's not just hydro and transmission. I think even us, we have 2 wind energy projects now just outside of the community. And we want to be a part of, solutions. Recently, I was at a climate conference in Calgary of the AFN, and it seems like, a lot of the First Nations and our, settler allies are coming together now saying, what can we do together? We're in this kind of climate crisis, global warming, all the things that are happening, and we want to be collaborating. And I think, the more we start opening these spaces and realizing that, we have much more in common than, we lead on. And when we talk about those teachings and, everybody has gifts, everybody has knowledge, everybody has strengths and things that they bring to the table. And we have Indigenous ways of knowing, right? We say the ancestral knowledge of Turtle Island, and through our stories and through lived experience, we could bring that to the table as well. So by having this, structured balance of bringing the 2 worlds together, I think there's amazing strategies and ideas that we could come up with to help save our Mother Earth, really, essentially, but living in balance. At the end of the day, we'll realize that overconsumption, capitalism, and all the things that is what keeps, the world going at the end of the day is, we have to be mindful that we're getting warned day by day with all the major we'll say weather anomalies that are happening, and how our mother is warning us. Time to think different, time to see different, time to do different. And we want to be a part of those solutions. So I'll leave it there for now. There's so much more I could say, but again, I want to leave the opportunity for questions.
That was a mic drop moment there. Sorry, you can go, Cole.
I don't think I can follow that. So we can just go to the questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your time. I hope you all learned something, but is there questions? Oh, Kristen.
Hello, that was such an amazing talk. Thank you so much. So I want to try to take up Blaze's challenge to think outside of the box a little bit. So we're having this conversation about interprovincial interties today. So taking inspiration from the example of the Mohawk, if we were to have a intertie that went from Alberta to BC that was entirely Indigenous owned, because of course all infrastructure projects in Canada and the US are on Indigenous land. So if you had a project like that, so you could have a merchant transmission line, for example, where every segment was actually owned by the First Nation whose land, traditional land it was on. I'm curious to what extent, so in Alberta, for example, the Piikani and the Kainai First Nations also own part of a line, the rest of which is owned by AltaLink. And when they applied to the Alberta Utilities Commission to have their costs passed on through the rate the same way that AltaLink was able to do, they were denied. And so I'm wondering to what extent you've experienced that especially when you talk about Indigenous ownership of the projects, are the provincial regulators, are they open to it? I know for the Mohawk, they were able to get Quebec to actually change the legislation, but in Alberta anyway, the regulators didn't seem to know how to deal. So I'm just kind of curious, have you run into roadblocks like this where just you're running into these like antiquated regulatory structures that don't know how to treat Indigenous owned projects?
Good to hear.
So my comment was just going to be that obviously the Hertel isn't 100% owned by the Mohawk. We said we could have up to 49% ownership. Hydro still has to maintain 51% because they're the ones that are energy experts. Like, we're not energy experts, you know, but the fact is that it did go through our land, and that was a major recognition. And because we want it to be bringing to the table, like I said, the worldview of environmental stewardship and making sure that they're checking off these boxes. So like I said, you know, having our people be included in that, that wasn't anything we had ever experienced before. So it was definitely new. So in terms of it being 100% Indigenous owned, I don't know if that's possible right now. Even the way the partnerships get structured, if it's a LP or we just have to find creative ways of getting it through. And I don't know, like, I think province to province, dealing with governments, dealing with regulatory bodies, you're going to get different appetite, I guess, for this kind of projects and approvals. But I think we have to continue to push the line and ensure that, you know, we're trying different.
Yeah, and I think that your question speaks to like the heart of the problem, at least from the First Nations, is that, you know, we often are kind of having to deal with this governance problem where we do have the regulatory environment and the utilities and the policymakers. They're used to doing things a certain way. It happened for a long time, but now within a net zero world, we need to modernize how Indigenous utility or Indigenous transmission utility is regulated and how those costs are allocated fairly, because reliability and affordability is also important to us. But also reconciliation is also important, and climate change. So how do we incorporate those costs? So I think that I don't have any answers for you, but, you know, it's very challenging having to go from, you know, the regulator, but then that regulators, you know, their hands are tied because they just follow policy. Thing with the policymaker, then utility, and you just then the First Nations are always kind of left without an answer and in action. So it's a current problem, but it's one that I think that it's I think not insurmountable, but would love to hear more from people in this room about that.
And this is just this is just what I'd like to add, is that I think if we continue to go at this equation of Indigenous owned or Indigenous equity transmission lines, coming from a place of fear and the what ifs, and like, you know, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if the province stops it? Or what if we can't, you know, what if there's no commercial partner available or whatever? Then we're just setting up roadblocks for ourselves. So it's, I think, just in my work and what I really try to do is to, that is a question I don't have an answer to, but, you know, if that's something that we get to, then we find a solution. That's, there's no problem that doesn't have a solution. So yeah, I'm not fearful. Thank you, Krista.
Back here now.
So we had this question in the session this morning too about the spark. Like, what's the spark? Where do we start? And I want to ask that question to this panel as well. Like, where can we start with this? And I really like that point, Blaise. Like, and I completely agree. If we start with the, you know, well, here are the hurdles and what if this and all of these, like, we're, you know, and we're really good at doing that, right? We're really good at poking all of the holes before we even. And so, yeah, what is the other side of that though? Where can we where can this conversation start? Where can we go from here to move forward? What is our next step coming out of this room this afternoon?
For me, I think it's number one, wherever the company or the corporation whose territory they're on, they got to start building a relationship with the community, regardless if there's a project on the table. Get to know the government, get to know the elected council or maybe it's a traditional council, right? And that's why I wanted to highlight the fact that there might be an interplay or there might be both. Go to the community, get to know them. I kind of like what you were talking about prior to that. You don't want to have paralysis by analysis and just saying, what if, oh my God, and just create all these roadblocks. That's why I'm feeling now that we're at such a crossroads. And like I said, I think First Nations communities are changing their mindset. Obviously, our capacity is building. We're all speaking this foreign language now. That we understand each other, that we could find a way forward. And I think it's just a matter of us putting our best collective effort forward and just sitting down like people and having a conversation. It's not that difficult. And once we start realizing, like I said, the commonalities and our ability to do things that will have an impact. And once you start checking off those boxes and realizing, hey, we can make it happen. I think it's just having whether it's political will or the business will to want to try something new. You're going to get there. That's exactly how this happened. I'm sure, there was the detractors and the people who were like, this is never going to work. But then as we started to see, hey, we're having traction here, we're gaining momentum, and we're moving together. It really helped to, I think, inspire all of us that we're capable of so much. I think we just kind of become like our own worst enemy sometimes of not taking the risk or not taking the chance or what is the spark. I think it's in all of us to try to find a way.
Yeah, I guess to kind of build on that is, I mean, we've already said it that the way forward is to see Indigenous communities, Indigenous people as equal partners in these projects. That the way forward is no longer for project developers or operators to be looking at Indigenous people as or Indigenous nations as this roadblock, but rather as these partners and these assets to a project, so that the prosperity that will come from a project is not just going into the pockets of the BC Hydros or whoever. That this prosperity is shared, because the land is, if you want the land to be shared, then the prosperity must be shared as well. And that's not just impact benefit agreements. That is all the things that I spoke about, all those meaningful participation opportunities, up to and including equity and ownership. And for these projects to have Indigenous people leading them, Indigenous people taking the stage, Indigenous people speaking publicly about these projects and how they support these types of projects. And and the only way to get to that is to start the conversation, build the relationships, demonstrate respect and trust, and show how this is going to be a reciprocal project. And yeah, hopefully it works out.
Cool.
On that note, any examples of maybe not sectors, but industries that you see doing this well? This is sort of outside the realm of transmission, but I'm thinking, BC Hydro, and I think it was Hydro One had a new 50% equity stake for Indigenous nations. Any other examples like this that you'd point to as this is a good way forward, maybe beyond individual projects?
I'm going to let Cole take this one.
Hydro One is a good one, Hydro One, OPG, and like Hydro Quebec, it all took executive leadership to make those happen. And they made First Nations relationships a priority, and you see it. And it's now a standard across Canada, where now BC Hydro is offering a 50-50 equity ownership with the nations on the North Coast Line. That probably didn't happen if those folks out east didn't make First Nations a priority. And of course, it's the First Nations leadership too that's been asking for this. The nations who have been trying to build projects, trying to ask for equity ownership and transmission in those jurisdictions, which has happened for a long time. I mean, these things don't happen overnight. So there's a lot of work there. And then the White, of course, another one in northwestern Ontario, where there's the avoided cost of diesel as an added benefit to building that line. It's connecting remote First Nations to the grid. And then there's other smaller like transmission opportunities that are powering, specific industrial activities. But those ones I think are the main ones. And I think now First Nations, they want to be part of the planning. They want to be part of the infrastructure planning within their region. They want to be able to electrify who they want to decide gets their power. They want to unlock generation opportunities within their traditional territories because they know where the generation opportunities are, the storage opportunities. And then they want to decide, okay, we want to partner with utility because they have capital. They have access to foreign capitals, and there's benefits to partnering with the utility. But sometimes there are other options too. There are private developers who might want to partner, and it makes sense too. So certainly highlighting what First Nations want to do and being able to make that happen. This is the next stage, I think, where we're going.
Thank you. I just had a question around some of the language of a project of national interest. It sort of has some echoes there of some of those historical wrongs that have happened in the past. And just wondering what comes up in your mind when you think of potentially that designation for projects. Maybe we're already in that equity ownership space enough that you don't see bulldozing a project through that has national support, but that doesn't have the nation support along the way as an option anymore. But just wondering what that evokes in your mind when you hear it and what maybe we need to look out for when we're looking at that kind of designation.
Yeah, no, that's a tough question because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not familiar with the divisions of powers and how that may operationally, like how that would play out. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you.
That's way too hard.
I don't know. It makes me anxious, quite frankly, when we want some kind of a reaction, because then to me, it undoes everything we just highlighted in the slides about, UNDRIP, duty to consult, free prior and informed consent to just move a project through in the interests of whether it's maybe even national security or national interest. I don't know, it just made me feel very unsettled. Like I've never even heard that term. So if that's something that's being thrown around, I could imagine how other First Nations individuals would feel because, as someone who's been in the political sphere and maybe someone who's completely oblivious and hears that is like, so what does that mean? They're just gonna do what they want, right? That's the immediate reaction. So I think it would create a lot of anxiety.
I think a project that's in the national interest would definitely be, baking in the oven for quite some time in advance. And there's, there should always be time to consult.
For sure.
But maybe with the Alberta Intertie, maybe it would work. I think maybe that's when we'd want it. Get that project built. Just for that one.
We have 1 minute.
I just wanted to share that if anybody wants more information about the project that I specifically shared today, I'll give you a website. It is www.kahnawake, which is the name of the community, KAHNAWAKE.com/Hertel, HERTEL. So to have some of the back information, all of the specs of the project, frequently asked questions, anything you want pertaining to it, and all of the news articles relating to the signing and when it'll be officially launched. Fired up, exactly. All right, well,
Miigwech, everyone.
yeah, Nyawa. That's the Ganyegeha word for thank you.
Click-o.